I want to thank you all for attending and for finding the link. And as you now know, I'm Ingrid Alpern, and my husband, Dwight. Dwight is an environmental lawyer who works on climate matters. We're new members of the Dutch Alum, so I'll give a quick intro. After majoring in Asian studies, I taught about the Holocaust, attended law school, and worked as a tax attorney in DC. I now do public policy work for a disability nonprofit, and my good friend Claude Kaxer has just managed to find the link. Thank you, Claude. I'm here to discuss my book about the escape of a Dutch Jewish family from Nazi-occupied Europe and the impact of that escape on the next generation. I just had to stop and smile at Linda. I'm not smiling about the impact on the next generation. This memoir is entitled My Separate Worlds, Daughter of the Holocaust, and thank you, and Evangelical Christianity. It also has a related story in it, The Doll. And I want to tell you that my first reader, when I was working especially on The Doll, was Eleanor Spieler. Eleanor read it and gave me very keen comments. It helped me a great deal. She was in our Chabara with Linda and Claude. So I'll let Dwight take over.
All right, Ingrid's presentation is going to be relatively informal, and I'm going to ask her questions about the book, and she'll answer, and then we plan to reserve time at the end for your questions. Before we start, if everyone could please mute themselves, maybe it looks like maybe already everyone has, so we don't have a problem with background noise. Your family escaped from the Netherlands during the Holocaust. Why do you say that this is a little known story?
Well, my Dutch mother escaped at age 18 with her younger sister and my grandmother from Nazi-occupied Europe through Vichy, France, onto a ship in Lisbon, that went to Suriname in South America. And the story of the Dutch Jewish survivors, there was at least one non-Jew too, who met on that ship, is so little known that the Dutch government recently gave a grant to a graduate student in Amsterdam to study the escape. And she is at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum now doing a fellowship.
What was your grandmother's role in the escape?
Our family's escape, the story of our family's escape, is a story of heroism and hope. My grandmother is the hero in our family. There are other heroes who were not in the family. She knew they should leave the Netherlands when Hitler came to power in 1933 in Berlin, in Germany. She couldn't convince my grandfather. She couldn't convince him even when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, when they prohibited Jews from going into public places, from parks to movie theaters, when they prohibited Jews from public transportation, using it. They fired Jewish government employees, including the president of their Supreme Court. Visser was his name. They forbid Jews, they required Jews to register. They required Jews to register all their properties and businesses, which were then confiscated, and my grandfather still refused to leave. When he was beaten at work, and he died the next day, my grandmother engineered her family's escape.
Was escaping dangerous?
Yes, escaping was incredibly dangerous. In fact, very few people could escape from the Netherlands. The Dutch Nazi collaborators were made by the Nazi occupiers part of the government. There was therefore a very efficient government there. And but I can't spend too much time on that. And so it was very difficult to get out. And when my family left with no papers, because theirs were marked with J's, and they had no time to get any false papers. My grandmother hired a passeur, that's like the leader on an underground railroad. That's what we know in our country. And the passeur knew where to take them, presumably which train might be okay to get on, because maybe the Nazis wouldn't come on that train. Maybe they had already checked papers on the train before that one and they were taking a break or something like that. And you had to trust the passeur. She hired the passeur for 20 people, 17 other Jews. So they all were going to meet. They went separately, of course. They couldn't go together. And they were meeting at a farmhouse in the southern part of the Netherlands, and the passeur would meet them there. So they got on the train without papers and hoped, and that train was safe. It was not checked. They got to the farmhouse. That was the last train they took, and they walked from then on. This gold coin was glued into the hollow heels of my mother's shoes. There were others in my grandmother's and my aunt's shoes. And my grandmother had those shoes heels specially made so they could do that, because they had Dutch paper money became worthless as soon as they crossed the Belgian border. And when they did cross the Belgian border, my mother said to me, she prayed to God, please let me survive the escape. A farmer saw them when they crossed, a Belgian farmer, and he yelled out to them, don't think we don't know what you're doing. We see you and we know. And my mother was carrying a great big bag of tomatoes. It was very heavy. And she begged my grandmother, please let me put the tomatoes down. I can't stand it anymore. And my grandmother said, keep carrying it. That's the only food we have.
You dedicated your book to Sally Noach. Can you tell us why?
Yes. Yes. Wonderful Sally Noach. In the 1 month before my family reached Vichy, France, the Vichy police, the French police, rounded up already 15,000 Jewish refugees to hand them over to Hitler. Pétain had made a deal with Hitler. Pétain was the leader of Vichy, France. I'll give you all the Jewish refugees if you stay out of Vichy, France. And of course, Pétain kept his part of the deal, and Hitler did not. So when my family came in, they went to the Dutch consulate. They had no papers. They had nothing saying that they were Jewish or non-Jewish. And it was a big danger to be in that situation as obviously a Dutch person speaking Dutch in Vichy, France. So they went to the Dutch consulate and they didn't show up and say, hi, we're Jews. They showed up and my grandmother made some lie about why they had no papers, but unbeknownst to them, the man to whom they were speaking was Sally Noach, a Dutch Jew hiding his identity under a non-Jewish name. And he knew that they were Jewish if they came without papers. So he gave them papers that said Calvinist, and he gave them a non-Jewish last name. It was close to their last name, which was Peichen. He gave them Pochen, but it was spelled very differently, and it was spelled as a non-Jewish name. And so my mother called them Protestant papers. And I'm going to read, because sometimes I'll read from the book a few times, because writing it helped me find the right words. And this will show you what they went through. For nearly 2 months in a hotel in Nice, the Garden Hotel, where honeymoons and sex trysts took place at other times in history, my mother, her younger sister, and moms, that's what we called my grandmother, then the sole survivors of the group of 20 with whom they had left the Netherlands, waited to get transit visas across Spain to Portugal. They came every night, my mother told me, the Vichy police. We heard their boots on the circular stairs near our room, very loud. I always thought, they're coming for me. Then we heard the screams of other Jews being pulled from their rooms and down that circular staircase. The screams of those other Jews, I will never forget as long as I live. Every night, these accomplices of Hitler banged on the door to the room where those 3 women stood. Any Jews in this room, they shouted. The uniformed figures looked under the bed and into the closets, and every night, my grandmother showed their Protestant papers from the Dutch consul in Lyon, Sally Noach, their savior. As soon as they saw those papers, they always apologized for bothering us, my mother said.
Now, we're going to shift subjects a little bit. At this time, Suriname was a colony of the Netherlands in South America. How did your family get to Suriname, and what was it like there?
When they reached the Dutch embassy in Madrid, they learned that there would be a ship that was going to take Dutch refugees to Suriname from Lisbon. So they had their transit visas then. And they left on December 1942 from Lisbon. My family and about 95 other Dutch refugees left on the ship SS Nyassa. This trip was arranged by the Joint Distribution Committee, which had prodded the Dutch government that was sitting doing nothing. And they managed to get to Suriname. On December 24th, 1942, they arrived on Christmas Eve. They arrived at Suriname, and all the refugees saw the Dutch flag, and they stood on that ship and they sang the Dutch national anthem. The Dutch governor put them into a camp with cots, separate and surrounded by barbed wire. He separated the men from the women, even if they were married. He gave them work duties. They were allowed to leave the camp around after 9 months. I've heard differing views on that. In the camp, the youth were allowed to continue their education, and my mother managed to finish the equivalent, my mother and her younger sister, of what we would call a college education in this country.
So how did your family come to the United States?
Well, because my mother had that education, The Dutch government in Suriname eventually gave her a job as a statistician. And when her diploma was given to her, the Dutch Minister of Education from England, where the Dutch government had run to, they gave my mother a job at the Dutch embassy in Washington, D.C. She took 3 airplanes, including a seaplane, to get up to Washington, D.C. And believe me, I know all this because my mother saved all of the primary source material. I have the tickets from the hotels, from a menu from the ship Nyasa. I have the ticket from the seaplane. I know what time she took off and what time she landed and where she went from. She couldn't give up any of that, and she couldn't tell me she had it. She had it by her papers next to her financial papers, which she told me, they're in that cabinet, and someday when you need them, look there. And that's where all of this was. So she got to DC. She brought her younger sister up to another job in the Dutch embassy, and eventually the rest of the family followed.
Now, how did the escape affect the survivors in your family?
Well, I did not have this when I wrote the book, but because I wrote the book, a very distant cousin from my grandmother's enormous family, what had been an enormous family before the Holocaust, got in touch with me through the internet somehow. And he sent me this letter from my Uncle Rob, who wrote to his wife's cousin who had somehow survived the Netherlands. And it was her son who gave me this translated copy. Uncle Rob wrote, September 23rd, 1945, Paramaribo, Suriname. It nearly seems to have been an unbelievable bad dream, but regretfully, it was not a dream, but the reality. A tremendous number of things have happened, and the emotional upset is so enormously large that it is difficult to process. My brother writes me that he has become hard through all the horrors, but what really has played out in our inner emotions is impossible to describe and cannot be gauged by any of us. This overwhelms even the strongest family. But how can words help? How can sighs help? How can crying help? It is more easily said than done, but we are facing established facts. And we are obliged to move forward and not look backward.
Can you tell us more specifically how the escape affected your mother?
She filled my childhood with stories of her escape and her love for her observant Jewish life in The Hague. By doing this, she seized every moment to relive that life and to be in touch with family members who were no longer alive, to tell me about them, to bring them to life for me. But after the war, my mother was afraid to be Jewish. From the moment that they cut those Jewish stars off of their clothes and walked out of their house wearing as many layers of dresses on their bodies as they could, she was afraid to tell anyone she was Jewish. And when she got to Washington, D.C., a non-Jewish friend of hers said to her, in the United States, there are people you have to be afraid of. They are Jews. So she never told anyone at the Dutch embassy she was Jewish.
How was the next generation of your family affected by the escape? And I'm talking about you and your cousins.
Okay. Well, you know what? I want to read something about my mother that I just realized that I should be reading. I'll try to keep it very short. My mother tried to give up her Jewish identity, but she realized she couldn't do that. But even though she later lived as a Jew again, she had nightmares all of her life, as described here. A high school weekend of reading a novel and sharing pizza and movie with a friend. My parents had gone to a medical convention in San Antonio. Late Saturday night, my mother and I sat in the kitchen talking about our weekends. That first night in San Antonio, she confided, I had a nightmare. I looked up from my milky tea. My mother continued, I dreamed that in the middle of the night, I heard loud footsteps coming down the hall to our hotel room. I heard banging on the door. Nazi soldiers burst into our room and shouted, Sini Goudschmidt, we missed you in Europe, so we've come for you here. She laughed a little, as if to lighten the atmosphere, after such a stark confession that more than 20 years later, the girl who had escaped could never escape her fear of being discovered on a train, in a farmhouse, in a field, on a street, in a hotel, and sent to a concentration camp. The impact on my cousins and me, again, I'm sorry, but I'm going to read. I hope I'm not boring you with this. Mom's was our hero, protector, deliverer, and though we did not know it as very young children, one day we would revere her, measure ourselves by her. We would come to know it was Mom's savvy, risk-taking, and courage that got us out of Europe during the war, that earned money selling her secret hoard of leather shoes to a Nazi officer, that found passeurs to sneak us past the Nazis from The Hague to Antwerp and into unoccupied France, that secured transit visas through Spain and Portugal and places on the ship to Suriname. All of this right after her husband died. Us, because if my grandmother had not saved our parents, we wouldn't exist. Us, because of the incredible overarching identification we have with their escape, pain, loss, and fear. When I was in college, Uncle Rob told me that before he and Tante Sonia left, months before Mom's left with my mother and her younger sister, they went to say goodbye to his parents. Then, barely 20 years old, Uncle Rob looked back at his parents' house as he and Tante Sonia walked away. He knew he'd never see them again. We cousins know what our parents and grandmother faced. We know about all relatives who did not survive. We live in that shadow. We know crisis or threat can be right around any corner. And we're trying constantly to protect the people we live with. I hope we don't drive them all crazy.
How did the trauma of the escape affect you differently from the way it affected your cousins?
Well, I do want to say that I may sound like we're aggravating sort of crazy people, but whenever there is a crisis, knowing what moms did, we tend to be problem solvers. I personally sit back and say, keep a level head and think logically. And I know that my cousins do exactly the same thing. I've seen them do it. But because of my mother's fear of being Jewish, her trauma affected me differently from my cousins. My Holocaust legacy led me into the cultural divide in America, divisions, I should say. I'm the daughter of a Dutch Holocaust survivor from The Hague and an evangelical Christian father from Crawfordsville, Indiana, whom my mother divorced very early in my childhood. They met in Washington, D.C. during the war. And when I was 2 years old, my mother and I showed up on the doorstep of Tante Sonia, Uncle Rob, of the apartment, very small apartment, of Tante Sonia, Uncle Rob, Mom's, our grandmother, and my cousin Lenny, who was born in Suriname a year before I was born in DC.
Can you tell us more about your early childhood?
Yes. I'll tell you that we did go on, our family did go on, as Uncle Rob said we needed to do in his letter. We found ways of having fun in life, picnics, hiking, going to museums, having a potluck dinner with a music group. And one of the things that we loved to do was go to Haynes Point. So in good weather, we made trips on the weekends to Uncle Rob's favorite place. Haynes Point in Washington, D.C. meant sunshine, white-winged sailboats on blue water, green grass where Lenny and I ran round and round our yellow and white striped blanket with its frayed satin border, where the grown-ups sat and unpacked food from crumpled paper grocery bags, sandwiches of heavy dark bread in the uneven slices Mom's cut from the shiny crusted loaf, thick pieces of chowder, or sometimes wurst, and always half-done pickles, apples, oranges, and cookies.
Now, did your Christian father have visitation rights?
Yes, he did. He came every weekend to take me places I liked. And the most important place he took me was Crawfordsville, Indiana. When I was 4 years old, alone, he took me. And I was old enough to remember it very well, to meet his family, our family, in their white clapboard house with their white porch swing. I'd never been in a house before. They showed me snapdragons, a green lizard. They showed me a swinging bridge and a snapping turtle, and how they held hands around the dinner table and prayed in Jesus' name, amen. My Dutch family didn't do that.
So when did Judaism become a part of your life?
Religious identity is a strong thread through my life. And my Jewish identity began to be instilled when I met my new Jewish daddy. I was 5 years old. He taught me my first Jewish law, that you're Jewish if you have a Jewish mother. So his sister, my new Jewish aunt, wrapped me in her old gauzy curtain until I turned into Queen Esther, and she took me to my first Purim festival. Shortly after that, I began religious school in our Reformed Jewish congregation. My strongest part of my Jewish identity became entwined with the stories that my mother told me about her Jewish life in The Hague, her life under Nazi occupation, her escape from Nazi-occupied Europe, and her horror at arriving in the United States in 1944 to see African Americans subject to the same kinds of laws she had experienced under Nazi rule. So in my life, one Jewish precept has become central, and that is to remember that we were once strangers in Egypt and so must respect and have compassion for the stranger, people who don't look like me or have my beliefs. For me, this translates to this. I know what my mother was lucky enough to escape from, and that provides me insight and empathy into the fear and the trauma, not only of Jews, but of all oppressed people in this country and all over the world.
You and your Jewish parents moved to Texas right after you started first grade. Tell us about the next big change in your life.
Well, my father came to Texas twice a year to visit me, and he became a secret. My mother told me that I had to keep his visit secret and his existence secret because she would be found to be a divorcee if I talked about him, and that was a terrible thing at that time, she thought. So it's very different now. She also taught me to look down on my father.
Did your father, your Christian father, want to have a say in your religious identity?
Yes, he did. He did. You have to know that I spoke to him as little as possible because that seemed like the only way not to betray my Jewish parents, who had told me that he was this terrible man and that I had to keep him secret. And I knew that I had the real world that I lived in with my Jewish parents and my Jewish family, and I had this world that didn't exist that I lived in with my Christian father. But this is my winter break when I was 10 or 11 years old. On the afternoon of the event that made this visit so memorable, we arrived in his motel room after seeing a Disney movie. The small room was filled with a narrow dresser, double bed, and two straight-back chairs beside a tiny round table. I sat on a chair. He walked over to the dresser and picked up a black book. It was the book known to me as the Christian Bible. He did this every Christmas vacation. He read me the story of the birth of Jesus. This year, I spoke. Please don't read that to me. I gave no explanation. I did not say that I'm Jewish. And when he reads to me from the Christian Bible, I feel awful because it's not part of my religion. Maybe if I had explained, he would have told me I was baptized as a Methodist, and that made me a Methodist. If only I could have talked to him, maybe I would have told him that I respected his religion and wished he would respect mine. Could he have accepted that his daughter was Jewish? When his religion was so important to him, I ran into the bathroom. He followed me and stood in the bathroom doorway to block my escape. All 6'3" of him loomed over me, stern, foreboding, like Cotton Mather. "Sit down," he commanded, and pointed to the closed toilet. I stood still. The situation was ludicrous, and I did not want anything to do with that book. "Sit down." I remained standing. He advanced toward me. "Sit down or I'll turn you over my knee," a thing he'd never done before and never threatened. He was a monstrous tremble of rage bent toward me. I sat on the cold surface of the closed toilet seat. He sat across from me on the bathtub edge, put the book on his gargantuan knees, and began to read, slowly enunciating every word in his deep baritone. His visits ended before my 17th birthday, and I was relieved.
Tell us about whether you and your father, your Christian father, were ever in touch again.
No, we weren't. Well, not on for many, many years, until I went to law school and went to it was in Washington, D.C., and I went to a Jewish folk music festival like they used to have here in this area. And I met Dwight, and I knew eventually that I wanted to marry him. And it was at my grandmother's Shiva that I decided I had to tell him. So I said, "Dwight, I have to tell you something absolutely horrible about myself. Let's go outside and take a walk." And that was the first time that I had ever told anybody this secret. Dwight convinced me I needed to meet my father, that I needed to face my reality and learn about it, my identity, and learn about it. So to me, it was the most frightening experience that I'd had up until that point. And Dwight said, "I'll be with you." I started by writing to my father again, what we now call snail mail, and he answered immediately. I learned that my father felt his calling was to write and sing songs to bring his religion to people. And in particular, something struck me that besides his very pious language, I'd never been exposed to language that pious before. And it was puzzling to me and was a bit of a culture shock for me. But also, after the Supreme Court ruled that prayer in public schools was unconstitutional, my father wrote a song about prayer in the school, the importance of it, and he recorded it. And one of his friends in the Back to God movement asked him to write that song. I had in first grade, on the first day of first grade, such a traumatic, maybe traumatic is too strong a word, but momentarily shocking or upsetting experience when I found that we had to stand up every day and recite the Lord's Prayer. So I would say the Shema under my breath, and I did that every day. And here he had written this song. Our letters continued. There was fear on both sides, my father's and mine. and his, I should say, about my fear, but also he had fear too. Each of us edged forward and we both pulled back. And I began to ask myself, what makes him act the way he did? Because I learned that he was far more fundamentalist Christian than the rest of his family. And I began to listen to everything and ask, what made him do that? What made him decide to be so fundamentalist? And the answer to that question led to what made him more human and approachable: the fear that had caused him to become more fundamentalist Christian than the rest of his family. And gradually, my father and I inched closer.
Have you had contact with Sally Noach's family?
Yes, I have. In 2014, I was put in contact with them through the curator of the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. She, at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, I received an email from her introducing me to Sally Noach's son and daughter. And I immediately wrote the most emotional 2 emails of my whole life, telling them what their father had done for my family and thanking them for that. And we've been writing to each other ever since. Not last April, it seems like last April 2019, our 2 adult children and Dwight and I met Irene at the AFI Cinema in Silver Spring, where she brought the movie Forgotten Soldier, about Sally Noach and what he did to save hundreds of Jews and non-Jews during the war. And she brought it to the Jewish Film Festival. We met her there, and then Dwight and I met her the next day again at her hotel for tea, and she was a gracious hostess. And the first thing she said to us when we met at the AFI was, "I feel we're mishpacha," and we all felt that way, family in Yiddish and Hebrew, I guess. We all felt that way. And Jack, her brother, and we email, and we feel very close to each other.
Okay, I think we should open this up for questions now, if people have any. So if you could raise your hand. Let's see if I can get to gallery view here. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, and then unmute yourself. I'll call on you so we can keep this organized a little bit, and you can ask your whatever questions you have. And if people don't have questions, that's fine too. There are a couple more things I could ask Ingrid about, but we'll be happy to have you ask questions if you wish. All right, Claude or Linda, I don't know which one it is that has the question. You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a question. This is a remark that I could take very seriously. You said that the day, you left Holland the day after your grandfather died. I think he said that. No, okay. But he ended, he had the phrase grandfather died. He was murdered the day after your grandfather was murdered. All the Jews who died in any way because of Nazi acts were murdered. That's the point I like making. So that's it.
If you, maybe you should repeat the question. It was hard.
You're cutting in and out, Claude. If you can get closer to your speaker, we can hear it better.
I beg your- okay. I'll try to make it brief. When you mentioned that your grandfather was killed, I think, I would have preferred you to have said murdered. I say that every act that the Nazis did that involved a death was a murder.
Okay. All right. Anne, do you want to go ahead? You have a question?
Thank you. And thank you so much, Ingrid. I mean, it's a remarkable story of survival. And, I really appreciate your sharing it with us. My question was, I wonder, and I haven't read your book and, it has inspired me to get it, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how your mother and your biological father ended up together and whether she disclosed at some point that she was Jewish or if she was still, she didn't disclose that. Anyway, that piece of it I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about.
I'm, to be perfectly honest, not 100% sure that she did, but I know that when I met my father's sister, she knew that I was Jewish, so my mother must have told him. My mother did not talk about her marriage to me, and I had to learn everything from what she left behind, all those papers she left behind. And from whatever her sisters could tell me, whatever I could learn from other people. So my suspicion is, and you'll see this in the book if you want to read it, is that she kept most of it secret. That she would go on a picnic with them on the beach, and she did not tell them about being on the beach at Scheveningen and eating a salty herring from the tail, holding it by the tail and eating it like this, and being with her friends, walking along the beach, discussing Nietzsche and other books. And I think she just didn't disclose all that, but she would sit with them and think about the life that she left.
All right, Ralph and Camilla, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, you mentioned about the passeurs, and you connected the dots between that and the Underground Railroad. That's actually very interesting, and you could also connect it to even the smugglers bringing people up through Mexico. But it just when you connect to these people and what that involves, and she had to pick it right. Could you say something about how your grandmother was able to, figure out who she could trust in that network? Because that's a pretty incredible part of the story as well.
That is a really, really observant question, because she couldn't know. You could never know. And one of the pastors, and she was spending thousands. I really can't remember how much, but it was maybe tens of thousands. And for these pastors, and for the three of them together. So one of the pastors took them into the streets in Belgium and just left them there. And he had their money, and he just didn't want to risk his life. So there they were in the street, and it was a crowded street, and there were German soldiers looking at them. And my grandmother approached a Jewish man. I don't know how she knew he was Jewish. Maybe he was still silly enough to be walking around with peyote and a hat. I don't know. But anyway, she approached him, and he helped her find another pastor. and pay more money. More gold coins.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I have a couple other things I could ask you.
Oh,
wait,
there's another question.
yeah, Linda, go ahead.
Like to make
Or Claude.
a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, if you're close.
Now we can't hear you. Go back to where you were before.
I can't tell where the speaker is.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, let's go. I think your book is really, really beautiful and inspiring. You lived with a lot of secrets, which was very difficult for you. And I think you're a survivor and a very courageous person, because you wanted to get to the bottom of the secrets, but also to understand each of your parents and see them as human beings and what they were really like. And I think that your journey this book is about your journey as much as your mom's and the moms, and how you have come to understand all of these players in your family and appreciate them for who they were. And you've become an incredibly, I don't know what to say, just an amazing person yourself as a result of all of this. And writing the book was like your culmination of all that you've learned about yourself and about life. So I commend that book to everybody. It's very poetic in a lot of places, and you describe some of your experiences. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you very much, Linda. That's overly kind. I really appreciate it.
It's my takeaway from the book and from knowing you for many years.
I see one question in the chat. Ingrid, how old was your mother at this time? That's a question.
She was 18 when they left, and she was 20 when she came by herself on those 3 planes to the United States. And she stayed in what is that hotel for girls on 16th Street, just north of the DC JCC. That's where she was staying.
The YWCA.
No, I can't think of the name of it, but it's the hotel for girls is the end part of the name, but it's still there. Yeah. Okay, there's another hand up from Claude or?
No, I think.
That was my hand.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, along the line of what we've been talking about, would you say that this book teaches lessons?
Well, there are probably a lot of things that maybe the most important thing that I think I learned from this and want to express, and I didn't learn it, of course, from writing the book, but from my life, is what I mentioned before, that this escape has taught me, and my cousins and I talk about this, and my kids do too, that we have the insight into the fear and the trauma of other oppressed people. And that gives us an obligation, really, to do something for them and not to let it happen. That's an important piece. If you let it happen, if you write the train schedule because you were writing train schedules way beforehand, and you continue writing train schedules, then you're letting it happen. It can be that simple. The documents of destruction.
When you're talking about train schedules, you mean train schedules taking people to the concentration camps?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
Now you mentioned
the Nitkins have a question.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
I just noticed it.
Yeah, I think what you just said, Ingrid, reminded me of something I really noticed, a remark you made about how your mother immediately upon landing in the US noticed the parallel between the Nazis and how Blacks were being treated here. And, you know, to think that to her it was just so obvious, and yet all the whites, you know, just, you know, we're taking it as that's normal. And, you know, it's just the way that we have our perceptions manipulated and how much we can take something for granted, and that she just instantly saw it the minute she came in. Do you think, at least that's the impression I got from what you said. And did you find her to continue to notice that as you during your childhood?
Yes, all during my life. Mhm.
You didn't raise the hand. So.
Pardon?
Oh, no, nothing.
All right, you mentioned your grandmother's role in the escape. Are there other heroes that were part of this escape?
Yes, two of my mother's high school friends, Emil Mertz, came to our house. He broke the law to come in as a non-Jew, to come into a Jewish home. And he helped tutor my mother when she was thrown out of the public school where he met her. And they were 17 or 18 years old at that time. And he also did a lot to help my grandmother. You know, how did she get the hollow heels in the shoes? Emil was probably the one who took the shoes to the shoemaker, and he could ask to do that, but he was risking his life when he asked, because the shoemaker could have turned him in. You know, this is suspicious. Who wants a hollow heel? That kind of thing. I guess he went to someone in the resistance, but the point is that Emil did a lot of things to save my family and his own wife, whom he saved under the floorboards of his kitchen during the whole war.
Because she was Jewish.
Because she was Jewish. Thank you. Yeah. And then Senta Boder-Hovertz, my mother's other friend, gave my mother Senta's ID card because they looked pretty much alike. And she just forced it on my mother when my mother went to say goodbye to her. So she ended up in a German prison in The Hague. And she was, according to Yad Vashem, she was interrogated, which means beaten. My mother had her named one of the righteous among the nations afterwards. And what I just told you is the only story my mother told me the whole time I was growing up. When my mother spoke at my daughter's class, high school class that was studying the Holocaust, my mother told me the true story about why Senta was picked up. What my mother said is she was walking on the street and the Germans came up to her and said, a German soldier, where's your ID card? But that's not what happened. And it's in the book, and it's a very painful story that my mother had to live with for a long time. But she did have Senta named as righteous among the nations.
Now, 50 years after the escape, you persuaded your mother to fly up from Texas and to give an interview at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where, of course, they were doing interviews and recording them for posterity. Can you tell us about what her reaction was to providing this interview?
Yes, it was very difficult to persuade her to speak about the Holocaust, but she did it. She finally came up. She flew up from Texas. We went down there, and as soon as we walked out of the interview, she said to me, "This is the best thing you've ever done for me in my whole life." She said, "Talking about the escape makes it less frightening. It just makes it part of life."
Okay. Well, if we don't have any further questions, I think we should end the meeting, and we appreciate everybody being here. And we hope.
Thank you very much for coming. And Jane, it's nice to see you. I didn't have a chance to say that.
Does
It was
anybody,
nice.
does anybody know how to save the chat?
I don't think there's really anything that we need to say, to be honest.
Okay.
I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay.
Okay, that makes it easier. And
Yeah.
Peggy, I didn't get to see your face, but thank you for coming. It was nice to meet you too. Since we're new, this is a wonderful way to meet people.
Mhm.
And Anne,
Yes,
again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I get to meet you in person someday. And
I was, oh,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say my mom was a refugee from Berlin. Didn't have, I mean, her story is less frightening in some ways than yours, but I'd love to get together and compare stories sometime. Yeah.
I would too.
All right.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you, Peggy.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
you very much.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Thanks.
Oh, so good to see everybody.
We will all meet in person sometime.
Yes, I look forward to it. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.